The massive crystal dome of the Galactic Council stretched high above the gathering of alien species, its translucent walls catching the light of 3 different suns. Inside this grand chamber, representatives from across the galaxy had come together for what many considered routine business: trade agreements, territorial disputes, mining rights, the usual matters that kept the galactic community running smoothly. But today would be different. Today, Ambassador Kethfer of the Zelthian Empire had requested urgent audience time, and his message would shake the very foundations of what these species believed about warfare and conquest. Kethfer stood at the central podium, his reptilian form casting long shadows across the polished floor. His usually proud bearing had been replaced by something his fellow council members had never seen before: genuine fear. The scales along his neck, normally a vibrant green, had dulled to an ashen gray. His hands, once steady enough to sign death warrants for entire planets, now trembled as he gripped the speaking device. The translation matrix hummed to life, converting his native tongue into the hundreds of languages represented in the chamber. When he spoke, his voice carried across the vast space, reaching every corner where alien dignitaries sat in their specially designed seats. "Its honored representatives," Kethfer began, his voice barely above a whisper before growing stronger. "I stand before you not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. 3 cycles ago, my empire encountered a species we had never seen before. They called themselves humans, and we believed them to be nothing more than another primitive race ready for subjugation: the insectoid." Vracti in the eastern section of the chamber clicked their mandibles in what their species considered polite attention, though their compound eyes showed little interest. These creatures had conquered 17 star systems in the past decade alone, turning entire worlds into hive complexes. What could possibly concern them about some unknown species? Above them, the gaseous Etherians floated in their containment fields, their cloud-like bodies pulsing with colors that indicated mild curiosity mixed with skepticism. They had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, their long lifespans making them natural observers of galactic history. To them, Kethfer's tale sounded like another defeated commander seeking to blame his failures on enemy superiority rather than his own incompetence. In the most prominent seats, representatives of the Corbin Republic sat with the confidence of a species that had never known true defeat. Their four-armed forms were perfectly suited for warfare, their natural aggression having carried them to dominance over vast territories. Admiral Vextar, their primary military representative, looked particularly unimpressed as he listened to Kethfer's words. "We approached their space with standard protocol," Kethfer continued, his voice growing more urgent. "Our scouts reported settlements on the outer rim, poorly defended and ripe for harvest. The humans possessed basic space travel technology, primitive weapons, and small defensive fleets. By every measure we understood, they should have surrendered. After the first demonstration of our superior firepower, the Zelthian ambassador paused, his throat working as he swallowed hard. The memory of what followed clearly still haunted him, even after 3 full cycles had passed. We began with their frontier colonies, expecting quick capitulation. Instead, we found something we had never encountered before. When we destroyed their first outpost, they did not flee. When we captured their second settlement, they did not negotiate. When we obliterated their third colony, they did not surrender. Instead, they began to fight back with a ferocity that defied all logic. Several representatives shifted in their seats, some beginning to pay closer attention. The Corbin delegation, however, remained unmoved. They had faced desperate enemies before, species that fought fiercely when cornered. Such resistance was temporary, always breaking when faced with overwhelming force. But it was not merely their fighting spirit that proved so dangerous, Kethfer pressed on. It was their refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was the only logical option. Human vessels would ram our ships rather than retreat. Human soldiers would fight to the last breath rather than surrender. Human commanders would sacrifice entire fleets to save a single colony. The chamber grew quieter as the implications of his words began to sink in. Most species in the galaxy fought according to established rules, retreat when outmatched, surrender. When cornered, negotiate when facing extinction. These were the natural responses of intelligent beings who understood the value of survival over pointless resistance. "We thought we understood warfare," Kethver said, his voice dropping too barely. Above a whisper, "We believed that every species would eventually recognize superior force and submit. But humans operate by different principles entirely. They do not calculate odds of survival. They do not weigh costs against benefits. They simply refuse to. Stop fighting." Admiral Vexstar finally stood, his forearms crossing in a gesture of dismissal. His species had conquered hundreds of worlds, facing every type of resistance imaginable. Nothing this frightened Zelthian could describe would be beyond their capabilities to handle. "Your failures do not concern us, Zelthian," Vexstar declared, his voice carrying the confidence of countless victories. "If your warriors were too weak to handle primitive humans, perhaps you should have brought more ships or better weapons. The Corbin Republic has never encountered an enemy we could not defeat." The words hit Kethver like physical blows, and for a moment, his composure cracked entirely. "It was not weakness," he shouted, his voice rising to a desperate shriek that echoed through the crystal dome. "It was their persistence, their absolute refusal to accept defeat. Once you become their enemy, you will never know peace again." The chamber erupted in dismissive chatter. Representatives turned to their neighbors, sharing quiet conversations about the Zelthians' obvious emotional instability. Some laughed openly at what they perceived as elaborate excuses for military incompetence. Others simply looked bored, ready to move on to more practical matters. But Kethver was not finished. "They do not forget," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Every slight, every attack, every casualty, they remember it all. And they will pursue you across the galaxy to extract payment for every drop of blood you have spilled." The laughter died away slowly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Something in the Zelthian's tone suggested he was not exaggerating, that he had experienced something truly beyond normal galactic warfare. As the noise subsided, Kethver sat down heavily in his designated seat, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had tried to warn them, tried to share the terrible knowledge he had gained through bitter experience. But like his own people before their encounter with humanity, these representatives could not comprehend an enemy that fought by entirely different rules. The galaxy would learn soon enough, just as his empire had learned. And when that day came, they would remember his words with the same fear that now haunted his every waking moment. The warnings of Ambassador Kethver echoed through empty space as the Corbin Republic's war fleet moved toward human territory. Admiral Vexstar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's edge, watching the stars shift past the view screen. Around him, his officers worked with the quiet confidence of veterans who had conquered more worlds than they could count. Operation Swift, the Talon had been planned for months. Intelligence reports showed human colonies scattered across the outer rim, poorly defended and isolated from their homeworlds. The Corbin military machine had perfected this type of campaign over centuries. Strike fast, hit hard, and move on before the enemy could organize effective resistance. The target was New Geneva, a human settlement on the edge of their territory. According to Corbin scouts, the colony housed nearly 50,000 humans and served as a regional trading hub. More importantly, it was far enough from Earth to ensure no immediate reinforcements could arrive. As the Corbin fleet dropped out of hyperspace, the human colony appeared on their sensors like a small jewel against the black of space. The settlement, spread across the surface of a green world, connected by gleaming transport tubes and protected by a modest defensive grid. "All ships, begin bombardment," Vexstar commanded. "Target defensive installations first, then population centers." The attack began with devastating precision. Corbin dreadnoughts, each one larger than most human ships, opened fire with weapons that could crack planets. The human defense platforms, small and outdated by galactic standards, crumbled under the assault like paper in a fire. The colony's energy shields flickered and strained under the barrage. These barriers, designed to protect against meteor impacts and solar storms, were never meant to withstand military-grade weapons. Within 3 hours, the shields collapsed entirely, leaving the settlement exposed to the full fury of the Korban fleet. But even as their defenses crumbled, the humans refused to surrender. Colonial Administrator Li Hun coordinated the desperate resistance from his command bunker, deep beneath the colony's Capitol building. His voice crackled over emergency channels as he directed civilian evacuations and military responses. Defensive units, fall back to secondary positions, Li Hun ordered, his fingers flying over the control console. Priority Alpha to all Earth command frequencies. We need immediate reinforcement. Above ground, human soldiers fought with a ferocity that surprised even the experienced Korban warriors. Captain Park Jin led a squad of colonial marines against a Korban landing party near the spaceport. His men were outnumbered and outgunned, but they refused to retreat. They're not just fighting, Park Jin reported to his surviving troops as they took cover behind a destroyed transport vehicle. They are learning, adapting. Every attack teaches them something new about our enemy. The human defenders studied their opponents with scientific precision. They noted the Korban weakness to high-frequency sound waves. They discovered that Korban battle armor had vulnerable joints. They learned that Korban soldiers relied heavily on their technological advantages and became less effective in close combat. This information flowed back to the command bunker, where Li Hun compiled detailed reports on Korban tactics, weapons, and weaknesses. Even as his colony burned around him, he transmitted everything to Earth Command, ensuring that future human forces would benefit from their sacrifice. The battle raged for 18 hours. Human civilians joined the fight when their defenders fell, using mining equipment and construction tools as weapons. Children who should have been playing in parks instead carried ammunition to soldiers. Elderly citizens who should have been evacuating instead volunteered for the most dangerous missions. But courage alone could not overcome the vast technological gap between the two forces. One by one, the human strongholds fell. The spaceport burned. The government buildings crumbled. Residential districts became battlegrounds, where families fought and died, defending their homes. As the sun rose over New Geneva, the last human resistance finally collapsed. Captain Park Jin fell, defending the medical center, his body shielding wounded civilians from Korban fire. Administrator Li Hun transmitted his final report to Earth Command before Korban soldiers breached his bunker. Admiral Vextar surveyed the conquered colony from his flagship. Satisfied with the operation's success, the human settlement had been secured with minimal Korban casualties, and their forces were already preparing to move on to the next target. Everything had proceeded according to plan, but something bothered him about the human response. Most species would have surrendered once their defenses failed. Others would have evacuated their populations to save lives. The humans had done neither, fighting to the very end with an intensity that seemed almost irrational. The admiral, his communications officer, called from across the bridge. "We're intercepting human transmissions on all frequencies." Vextar is 4. Eyes focused on the junior officer. "Surrender terms?" "No, sir. They're calling for reinforcements. And... The officer hesitated, checking his readings again. "They're calling for revenge." The communications flowed through space at the speed of light, carrying news of New Geneva's fall to every human outpost and colony. But these messages contained more than just reports of defeat. They carried detailed intelligence about Korban, tactics, weapons, and vulnerabilities. They carried the names of every human who had died. They carried a promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Admiral Vextar studied the transmission data with growing unease. "Empty threats," he declared, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Prepare the fleet to move to the next target." But even as he spoke, long-range sensors detected movement in the depths of space. Human ships were converging from every direction, abandoning their patrol routes and defensive positions. Military vessels, merchant ships converted to carry weapons, even civilian craft loaded with volunteers, all moving toward Korban space with deadly purpose. The hunt had begun. The aftermath of New Geneva's destruction rippled through human space, like a stone thrown into still water. What followed would reshape the galaxy's understanding of warfare forever. The human response defied every established principle of military doctrine that had governed galactic conflicts for thousands of years. Traditional warfare between civilized species followed predictable patterns. Fleets would meet in open space, exchange fire until one side gained advantage. Then the losing force would retreat to regroup or surrender. Territorial disputes were settled through these formal engagements, with clear winners and losers accepting their outcomes according to ancient galactic law. But the humans had different ideas entirely. Captain Kim-Soo commanded a squadron of 12 fast attack vessels, each one barely larger than a Korban shuttle. His ships carried minimal armor and weaponry, designed for speed rather than sustained combat. Under normal circumstances, they would never engage capital ships directly. But these were not normal circumstances. Target acquired reported his tactical officer as they approached a Korban supply convoy. 3 freighters, 2 escort destroyers. Kim-Soo studied the formation through his view screen. The Korban vessels moved in standard protective pattern, the larger warships flanking the cargo ships. Their crews probably felt secure, believing their escort adequate against any human attack. Strike Teams Alpha and Beta hit the engines on the escorts, Kim-Soo ordered. Gamma and Delta disable the freighter's navigation systems. In and out, 30 seconds maximum. Human attack ships swept down on the convoy like hunting birds. Their weapons fired in precise bursts, targeting critical systems rather than attempting to destroy the larger vessels. The Korban escorts, caught completely off guard, tried to return fire, but found their targets already gone. In less than a minute, the convoy was crippled. The freighters drifted helplessly while their escorts struggled with damaged propulsion systems. But the humans didn't press their advantage or demand surrender. They simply vanished back into the void, leaving the Korban crews to wonder what had just happened. This scene repeated itself across dozens of star systems. Human forces struck supply lines, communication networks, and isolated outposts with surgical precision. They never stayed to fight extended battles or claim territory. Instead, they hit fast and disappeared, leaving confusion and fear in their wake. Commander Choi Min operated from a converted merchant vessel that served as mobile command center for human intelligence operations. Her ship looked harmless from the outside, just another cargo hauler moving through space. But inside, banks of computers tracked every Korban ship movement, analyzed their communication patterns, and predicted their next moves. They're changing course again, reported her communications specialist. Admiral Vextar's flagship just altered, heading toward the Kepler system. Choi Min studied the tactical display showing Korban fleet movements across multiple sectors. Red dots represented enemy ships, while blue markers showed human forces. The pattern was clear. The Korban fleet was trying to retreat toward their home territory. But human ships shadowed their every move. Relay coordinates to all strike teams, she ordered. Make sure they know that Korban will need to refuel at Kepler Station. The information flowed through human communication networks with remarkable efficiency. Every captain, every squadron leader, every intelligence operative received updated targeting data within minutes. The human fleet operated like a single organism, each part working in perfect coordination with the whole. Lieutenant Han Sol stood on the bridge of the destroyer Retribution, watching the main display track the fleeing Korban fleet. His ship was one of the larger human vessels, heavily armed and capable of engaging enemy capital ships directly.
Yes.
But his orders were to observe, not attack. "They're running scared," commented his weapons officer. "We could take out half their fleet right now." "No," Han Sol replied, remembering his training. "We follow the plan. Let them think they're escaping." The Retribution maintained its distance, just close enough to keep the Korban fleet on sensors, but far enough to avoid detection. Around them, smaller human vessels darted in and out of sensor range, keeping constant pressure on the retreating enemy. Back on the human command ship, Admiral Yuntae studied reports from across the battle zone. His forces had been pursuing the Korban fleet for 3 weeks now, never allowing them to rest or regroup. The psychological effect was becoming obvious. Corbin crews were making mistakes, their commanders growing desperate. "Sir," reported his intelligence officer, "Corbin forces are requesting permission to retreat to their home system." Admiral Yunte nodded slowly. "Let them run. They'll lead us exactly where we need to go." This strategy confused many of his subordinates. Traditional military doctrine called for destroying enemy forces when they were weakened and retreating. But the admiral understood something deeper about human nature and warfare. They weren't just fighting to win a battle, they were fighting to ensure this enemy could never threaten humans again. The Corbin fleet continued its retreat, but every stop became a nightmare. When they tried to refuel at space stations, human ships would appear and disable the fuel pumps. When they attempted to rest and repair their vessels, human attackers would strike at their most vulnerable systems. When they sent distress calls to their home world, they discovered that human forces had systematically destroyed every communication relay along their route. Days turned to weeks, and the proud Corbin dreadnoughts became increasingly desperate. Their crews jumped at sensor shadows, mistaking asteroids for human ships. Officers who had commanded with confidence now second-guessed every decision. The psychological pressure was taking its toll on warriors who had never experienced prolonged fear. Admiral Vexter stood alone on his flagship's bridge, staring at the tactical display. Another supply ship had just vanished under human fire, its crew probably dead or captured. His once mighty fleet was being slowly picked apart by an enemy that refused to fight fair. For the first time in his military career, he felt true fear. The fortress world of Corbin Prime's outer system had stood unconquered for over 3 centuries. Its massive orbital defense platforms bristled with weapons capable of destroying entire fleets, while automated missile systems created an impenetrable web of death around the planet. Every military commander in the galaxy knew this system as the ultimate stronghold, a place where even the most powerful enemies would break themselves against its defenses. Admiral Vextar felt the first genuine relief he had experienced in months. As his battered fleet approached the fortress world, behind him lay weeks of nightmare pursuit, human ships appearing like ghosts to strike at his forces before vanishing into the darkness. His once proud fleet of 200 vessels had been reduced to fewer than 30 operational ships, their crews exhausted and demoralized. "Sir, we're receiving clearance codes from Corbin Defense Command," reported his communications officer, a young Corbin whose forearms trembled with fatigue. "They're activating the full defensive grid." Through the view screen, Vextar watched the fortress world's defenses come alive. Massive energy weapons emerged from hidden positions on the planet's surface. Orbital platforms the size of small cities powered up their shields and weapon systems. Automated defense satellites began moving into attack formations, their sensors sweeping space for any sign of human pursuit. Finally, Vextar muttered to his tactical officer, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. "Let the humans try to break through these defenses. They'll learn what it means to attack a properly fortified Corbin position." His tactical officer nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Sir, should we contact the home fleet for reinforcements? Our losses have been severe." "Not yet," Vextar replied, studying the defensive displays. "Let's see how the humans handle real opposition first. They've been picking off isolated ships and convoys. This will be different." Even as he spoke, something felt wrong. The fortress world's defense grid was operating, but not exactly as he remembered. Warning lights flickered across his control panels in patterns that seemed somehow off. Status reports from the orbital platforms showed minor irregularities in their targeting systems. "Sir," his communications officer called out, his voice rising. "With concern, I'm getting strange readings from the defense network. Some of the satellites aren't responding to standard command protocols." Vextar moved to the communications console, his 4 eyes scanning the readouts. The defense satellites were active, their weapons charged and ready, but their identification codes were wrong. Instead of the familiar Corbin military signatures, they displayed patterns he didn't recognize. "Run full diagnostics on all systems," he ordered. "Check for equipment malfunctions or communication interference." The next few minutes brought increasingly disturbing reports. Orbital Platform 7 wasn't acknowledging direct commands. The missile defense grid showed gaps in its coverage that hadn't existed before. Most troubling of all, The main communication array was broadcasting on frequencies that didn't match Corbin military standards. "Sir," the communications officer reported with growing panic, "the defense network. It's been compromised. Someone has taken control of major portions of the system." Before Vexstar could respond, alarms began blaring throughout his flagship. His tactical officer's face went pale as he stared at his displays. "Sir, massive hyperspace signatures detected. Multiple fleets dropping out of jump, all around the system." The space around Corbin Prime's outer system began filling with ships. But these weren't Corbin reinforcements. Hundreds of human vessels materialized from hyperspace, surrounding the fortress world in a perfectly coordinated maneuver. Small fighters, heavy cruisers, and massive carriers took positions with military precision that spoke of months of planning, deep within the fortress world's orbital defense platform. Engineer Sergeant Kongbin removed his helmet and breathed. Recycled air that tasted of alien technology, his human combat suit, designed for boarding actions and infiltration missions, had barely fit through the maintenance shafts of the Corbin installation. But it had gotten him where he needed to be. "At work." Secured, he reported into his communication device, his voice carrying across space to the human fleet. "Defense grid is ours. It's all primary weapon systems under our control." Kang Bin and his team represented the culmination of weeks of careful infiltration. While the galaxy had focused on the dramatic space battles and running fights, human special forces had been quietly studying Corbin technology, learning their systems, and identifying weaknesses. They had arrived at the fortress world days before the fleeing Corbin fleet. Using captured enemy vessels and forged identification codes, the fortress world's defenses, designed to keep enemies out, had proven remarkably vulnerable to enemies who were already inside. Human engineers had spent years studying captured Corbin equipment, learning how their systems operated and how they could be turned against their creators. When the time came, they had simply walked into the installations and taken control. Admiral Vexstar stood frozen on his bridge, watching his certain sanctuary transform into a death trap. The orbital platforms that should have been protecting his fleet were now turning their weapons toward Corbin ships. The missile defense grid that should have stopped human attackers was instead targeting his own vessels. "How is this possible?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the alarms. His tactical officer worked frantically at his console, trying to regain control of the defense network. "Sir, they've locked us out of all primary systems. The humans must have been planning this for months." As the human fleet moved into attack formation, Admiral Vexstar finally understood the warning that Ambassador Kethfer had tried to give the Galactic Council. The humans hadn't just been hunting his fleet through space, they had been learning everything about Corbin technology, tactics, and territory. They had studied his people's weaknesses and planned for this exact moment. This wasn't just revenge for New Geneva. This was the complete strategic dismantling of the Corbin Republic's military might. Yes, the humans had turned the fortress world's own defenses against it, creating a trap that no amount of firepower could escape. The hunt was over, and the humans had won. The silence that followed the human fleet's arrival was deafening. Admiral Vexstar stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been the most powerful military force in the Corbin Republic. His tactical displays showed the grim reality only 18 ships remained operational from his original fleet of 200 vessels. Around him, his officers waited for orders that he knew would never come. The human fleet had positioned itself with mathematical precision, creating an inescapable net around the fortress world. Every escape route was blocked, every defensive position neutralized. The orbital platforms that should have protected them now pointed their weapons at Corbin vessels, controlled by human engineers who had spent weeks learning their systems. "Admiral," his communications officer said quietly, "we're receiving a transmission from the human flagship." Vexstar closed his four eyes for a moment, knowing that this message would seal his fate and the fate of his entire species. "Put it through." Admiral Yunte appeared on the main view screen, his human features calm and composed, despite the magnitude of the victory his forces had achieved. Behind him, the bridge of the human flagship buzzed with quiet activity as officers coordinated the final stages of their operation. Admiral Vextar Yunte began, his voice carrying across space with crystal clarity. You have two choices. Surrender unconditionally, or watch your remaining ships be destroyed one by one. You have 5 minutes to decide. The Corbin Admiral looked around his bridge at the faces of his surviving crew. These warriors had followed him through countless battles, had trusted him to lead them to victory. Now they looked to him for salvation that he could not provide. Sir, his tactical officer whispered, our weapons are still functional. We could make them pay a price for their victory. Vextar considered this option for a long moment.
The Corbin
Military tradition emphasized fighting to the death rather than accepting defeat. But looking at his tactical displays, he realized that resistance would only result in the complete destruction of his remaining forces. His people needed survivors to carry word of what had happened here. Open a channel to the human flagship, he commanded, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. When the connection was established, Vextar stood as straight as his exhausted body would allow. Admiral Yunte, I surrender my remaining forces unconditionally. We ask only that you treat our wounded according to the galactic conventions of war. The human admiral studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. Your surrender is accepted. Prepare to be boarded for inspection and processing. But then Yunte said something that shocked every Corbin officer on the bridge. Your surviving ships will be escorted back to your homeworld once our inspections are complete. Vextar could not hide his amazement. You single quotes releasing us? Messengers now, Yunte replied, his voice taking on a colder tone. Tell your people what happens when you attack humans. Tell them about the price of making us your enemy. Make sure they understand that this was not just a military defeat, it was a lesson. The next several hours passed in a blur of boarding procedures and inspections. Human soldiers moved through the Corbin ships with professional efficiency, cataloging weapons and technology, but treating the defeated crews with unexpected courtesy. They provided medical care for the wounded and food for the exhausted survivors. But even as they showed mercy to the defeated, the humans made sure their message was clear. Every Corbin officer was required to view recordings of the battle too, understand exactly how their supposedly impregnable fortress had been turned against them. They were shown the wreckage of their fleet, the casualty reports, the strategic analysis that had led to their complete defeat. Your people will want to know how this happened, explained Commander Choi Min as she briefed the senior Corbin officers. They'll want to understand why their greatest military force was destroyed by a species they considered primitive. Make sure they get the complete picture. 2 weeks later, the surviving Corbin ships limped back to their homeworld, carrying news that would shake their entire civilization. The Republic that had once controlled dozens of star systems and commanded fear throughout the galaxy now faced the reality of total military collapse. But the effects of the human victory extended far beyond Corbin space. Word of the defeat spread through the galaxy's communication networks like wildfire, reaching every species and every world. The story grew in the telling, becoming a legend that would be remembered for generations. In the crystal halls of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Kethfer stood before the assembled representatives once more. This time, the chamber was packed with delegates from every major species, all desperate to understand what had happened to the Corbin Republic. I warned you, Kethfer said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. 3 cycles ago, I stood in this very spot and tried to tell you about the humans. I explained that they do not fight like other species, that they do not accept defeat, that they do not forget their enemies. He paused, looking around at the faces of representatives who had once dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a defeated commander. Now, they hung on his every word, finally understanding the magnitude of the threat they faced. The Corbin Republic was the most powerful military force in this sector, Kethfer continued. They had conquered hundreds of worlds, defeated thousands of fleets. But the humans did not just defeat them, they destroyed them completely. And they did it not through superior technology or larger numbers, but through superior understanding of warfare itself. As the council session ended, representatives hurried back to their ships, carrying urgent messages to their homeworlds. The whispers had already begun spreading through the galaxy, passed from ship to ship, from world to world, from species to species. Never attack the humans. They will never let you flee. In the human sector, Admiral Yun-Tae completed his final report on the operation. The message was clear to any species considering aggression against humanity. Humans operated by different rules than other galactic civilizations. They did not just fight to win battles or claim territory. They fought to ensure they never had. To fight the same enemy twice, the lesson had been taught, and the galaxy would never forget it.